The human head weighs 8 pounds. Learning begins with students' misconceptions.
Jerry, do you know the human head weighs 8 pounds?
In the 1996 film Jerry Maguire, a misconception was stated by an adorable little boy. That misconception went on to be repeated often by adults seeking to make a pop culture joke. Today's presentation will focus on addressing the many misconceptions that occur in your classroom. Today we're going to talk about an article written by Campbell, Schwartz, and Winschittel called "What We Call Misconceptions May Be Necessary Stepping Stones Towards Making Sense of the World." As we move through today's presentation, you can expect us to go through the background of why student misconceptions is an important topic, misconceptions as a learning tool, challenges of implementing active reasoning with misconceptions, talk science primer, and academically productive talk, and finally we'll finish up with questions for growth. We'll begin with background on why student misconceptions is an important topic. Conceptual change theory has roots in the work of Jean Piaget and evolved through the work of Posner, Streich, Hewson, and Gerzog, who published an article in 1986 on the importance of students' conceptual ecologies, a term coined by Stephen Toulmin in 1972. A conceptual ecology is comprised of the concepts that a student enters the lesson with and uses to organize their investigation of the new information and administer conceptual change. It's through these conceptual ecologies that students form questions and determine relevance of the new information. Through the work of Posner et al., 4 components of promoting conceptual change in the classroom were formed. Today's presentation pulls the first component of conceptual change, determining misconceptions, and elaborates on how educators can use misconceptions to promote learning. However, social constructivism is an important cog in the wheel of student learning as well. Through collaboration, students have the opportunity to discuss, investigate, and form new ideas. It is through many of these conversations in partners, small groups, or even whole class discussions that students can question and accommodate their conceptual ecologies. Campbell, Schwartz, and Winschittel reference the next generation science standards throughout their article, including the importance of students engaging in science and engineering practices throughout the learning process. Through these practices, students are able to engage in sense-making and work through the process of accommodating their preconceptions. So what is sense-making? If the goal is for students to engage in scientific practices to foster sense-making, we need to make sure we understand what sense-making is. Campbell et al. Define sense-making to be how students and teachers work through ideas to generate meaningful connections. Sense-making is prevalent throughout the next generation science standards, including in many assessments. Every teacher has experienced the disappointment of students forgetting what they've already been taught. It's demoralizing when you feel like you've taught the information well. How could they forget that? Generally, teachers are looking for students to not learn in the short term, but to move that information to long-term memory and gain long-term retention of the concepts. To help with student understanding and retention, the last thing you want to do is correct their misconception. Science knowledge cannot be transferred. Instead, it must be formed. As students have the opportunity to challenge their existing conceptions, they can accommodate them to form new conceptions. So if a misconception is a misunderstanding of information, how can it be beneficial to student learning? To answer this question, the first thing to understand is the purpose of identifying students' misconceptions. Educators want to identify misconceptions in their classroom because all students come into class with mental models that they've already formed to make sense of the world around them. Without discussing these mental models or misconceptions, students won't have the chance to challenge them, and if they don't challenge them, they can't change them. For students to be able to move forward and revise their mental models, the existing conception has to be discussed and challenged. Campbell, Schwartz, and Winschittel discuss a resources perspective, which ties back into the next generation science standards. A resources perspective to student investigations aims to provide a different way to address misconceptions instead of correcting them, which will lead to students memorizing information only to forget it. The idea is that students use the resources they have access to, like conversations, ideas, and experiences, to make sense out of phenomena and correct their own misconceptions. Shown on the screen is a figure from Campbell, Schwartz, and Winschittel's article. Take a minute to read through the example about how a teacher can respond to correct a misconception versus how a teacher can use a resources perspective to help move students towards correcting their own misconceptions. In teacher response A, the teacher corrects the misconception, which is very unlikely to be remembered by the student. In teacher response B, they use the misconception to continue drawing information out of the student and the class in order to move the conversation forward productively. In the classroom, the open-ended questioning that the teacher is utilizing leads students to a first draft talk where they have an opportunity to discuss their current conceptions, build on each other's ideas, and use active reasoning throughout the conversation. First draft talk can happen in partners, small groups, or whole class discussions. While the conversation is building to the formation of a new concept, the teacher should be prepared that the conversation won't be a linear experience. That brings us to challenges teachers will experience while helping students to identify and learn from their own misconceptions. The fact is, these conversations take time, and in a test-driven society, we often feel short on time to begin with. However, when you consider the benefits of long-term retention that come from students' conceptual understanding, the time will be well spent. As teachers and students get used to this new approach to learning, teachers will want to be patient and know that while it will take time for students to adapt, they will adapt with consistent implementation. Campbell, Schwartz, and Winschittel reference Michaels and O'Connor's Talk Science Primer throughout their article, which led me to seek out that resource. In Talk Science Primer, Michaels and O'Connor explain that academically productive talk occurs when teachers and students explore ideas and use evidence to build and critique academic arguments. In short, it's a conversation in the classroom that progresses learning. Since using student misconceptions as a stepping stone to learning incorporates the importance of classroom conversations and questioning, it seemed important to include a section in this presentation on how to make those conversations be productive for learning. Michaels and O'Connor highlight 5 ways academically productive talk is important. The goal is for students to engage in conversation that is respectful and benefits the whole group so that everyone has an opportunity to express ideas, listen, and learn together in a safe and supportive environment. As teachers, we're often encouraged to get student input. But when it comes to developing a list of ground rules, getting input from your students may make the list too long. Instead, students can feel heard if you have a whole group discussion on how the expectations and ground rules will benefit the discussion. In other words, you set the ground rules and then hold the discussion on how those ground rules will benefit both the discussion and each of the learners in the class. Michaels and O'Connor encourage you to have this discussion at the beginning of the school year so that expectations are set early and reinforced throughout the year. Michaels and O'Connor's Science Talk Primer is an excellent resource. I would definitely encourage you to explore it. It's a short and easy read, but extremely helpful and packed full of great ideas for prompts on how to extend students' thinking. Talk moves are ways you can keep the conversation going and guide students into thinking more deeply about the conversation. I've listed 9 of the talk moves printed in Talk Science Primer. But as you read through their work, Michaels and O'Connor provide examples for each of those 9 talk moves. Coming out of today's presentation, I'd like you to respond to the 2 questions shown here. Considering what we've learned about academically productive talk, what are 3 to 5 ground rules for academically productive talk that you would implement in your classroom, and why? Next, please consider a common misconception you experience in your class. How can you see yourself adjusting your instruction for that topic to make use of student misconceptions? If you're looking for more information on what we talked about today, here are the resources I used. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to your thoughts on the questions that go with this presentation.